Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and sign up for the newsletter. More importantly, share this episode with your family and friends, because I got a very important guest coming on. He is someone that has been at the forefront, fighting for liberty, freedom. He understands what happens when government gets too big and powerful, and he understands how government can manipulate the minds of the people. And we saw this for 4 years. So I want to welcome to the program Dr. Robert Malone, author of PsyWar, Enforcing the New World Order. Dr. Malone, pleasure to have you back.
Thanks for having me on, Nick.
The new book is fascinating. Everything that we lived through, you talk a lot in the book about the propaganda, right? The censorship that occurred, trying to control the narrative, and essentially control people's thoughts, because ultimately, if you control what people see, what people hear, what people could post, you change their opinions. Can you just give examples of how effective the government was at doing this during the coronavirus?
Well, of course, all of this has been further clarified by the Doge revelations concerning the USAID. And we've seen lots of examples of this in the Taibbi and Schellenberger writings concerning the censorship industrial complex, and the Twitter files and the Facebook files and all that. One example involves the Stanford interlacing of the Stanford Internet Observatory and CISA, which is kind of the coordinating agency that's been created with the Department of Homeland Security, and all of the alternative media. And now we learn, because of USAID and CIA, the corporate media is still very much engaged in an Opt-in Mockingbird-like activity, but it's been expanded internationally through USAID and in cooperation with the Soros-funded Free Society partnerships. So what this comes down to is specific examples, is illustrated in the book just by citing a couple of personal examples, not to make it about me, that were documented by the House investigation committees from the judiciary and weaponization of government, as well as was reported by the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. And in that, we learned that the government has actively worked through a number of kind of surreptitious influence activities that you might paraphrase as a nice social media company there. It would be a shame if something happened to it if you don't comply with our checklist, our punch list of people that we think should be censored. Of course, I've experienced this directly, so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. And thank you to those various committees. I've been named specific examples have been documented by those committees as reported in the book in their relevant reports. This comes down to, particularly under the Biden administration, but really it goes back at least to Obama. And we trace in the book, just for sake of, you got to put a stake in it somewhere. I mean, we could go all the way back to Sun Tzu in The Art of War if we want to talk about government and propaganda. But certainly a convenient starting point for modern propaganda and Mockingbird-like manipulation of information and media by our government. Convenient starting point is the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the subsequent events that are still yet in the news as we eagerly await the various documents that have been promised by President Trump. And we learn through rumor and innuendo on social media that the paper shredders are whirring as we speak across the Beltway. So, we've been living in an environment that certainly I was not aware as a red-blooded American patriot, conservative, libertarian kind of person. I wasn't aware of how heavily our access to information was being manipulated until I was on the receiving end of a lot of that technology. because I spoke truth to power concerning various government policies and programs and mandates involving, among other things, the mRNA vaccine products.
Yeah,
And that continues to the present.
It does. And what you brought up the Stanford. So we know the Stanford Integrity Project, which was about the election, was also run by the Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't run really by Stanford. And you had Jen Easterly. So you brought up CISA with Jen Easterly. She was the director, and she stated that it's the government's responsibility to control cognitive thoughts, right? It should be cognitive infrastructure, she deemed it. And she said the government should target misinformation and disinformation, which I always argue that the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation is government, but more importantly, malinformation, information that's true, but the government deems it can cause harm. In your opinion, given everything that we've witnessed over the last several years, how fearful are you that the next crisis, the American people will just do the same thing? They'll just obey, they'll comply, they won't ask questions, they won't push back. Is that a concern of yours?
So the history of this issue that you're talking about the kind of tendency of populations to readily accept narratives and messaging from authoritarian figures or authority figures, that's kind of a continuum, is also ancient, and the research behind it is ancient. And, we have the work back to Sigmund Freud, and then forward to Matthias Desmet as kind of the most modern iteration of that with his mass formation writings and theories. And we have Aldous Huxley in the early 60s, part of a famous family that other members of that family are integrally involved in what we now call the New World Order and One World Government initiatives, and these various nefarious groups that we often refer to as Bilderbergers and Atlantic Council and others. So Aldous Huxley, famously the author of Brave New World and mentor of George Orwell of 1984 fame, is on record in a black and white interview from the early 60s talking about this very issue of the distribution of the population in terms of its willingness to accept these promoted narratives. And he speaks about that historically, it's been observed repeatedly that about 20% of the population is highly suggestible. 20% are highly resistant to these narratives and question everything. Perhaps you and I are in that 20%. And the remainder that is often referred to as the persuadable middle kind of goes whichever way the dominant wind blows. Huxley argues that this is necessary, that if you didn't have this distribution in terms of willingness to accept government promoted narratives or propaganda, or whatever you want to call it, mandates, messaging. If you didn't have 20% that are highly compliant, then it would be impossible to govern society, and we'd be living in anarchy. So Huxley strangely argues that this is a good thing, and you'll recall that one of the tensions between Huxley and Orwell is Huxley's thesis is basically that we are all going to eventually embrace totalitarianism for our own good.
Take your soma and you'll be happy.
Yeah, just so. Whereas Orwell disagreed with that. So your question gets to whether or not the population will readily accept another round of this kind of fear-based propaganda. And there's a chapter in the book, chapter 4, on psychological bioterrorism, that speaks directly to the evidence and processes that what we are experiencing with bird flu right now, and we experienced with COVID, and we experienced with monkeypox, and the list goes on, is basically standard spycraft. That there's a well-known spycraft process for implementing what is the Soviets used to call information bioterrorism, or I call psychological bioterrorism, that starts with injecting narratives into the general population, typically through lower-level publications, and then those get amplified by academics that have vested interests in whatever the topic is, like infectious disease specialists that all benefit financially if there's another outbreak. And then it ramps up to something akin to what Nancy Pelosi calls the roll-up smear, in which you get more and more established, recognized conventional publications, then amplifying the message that has been injected through these other sources, citing experts that aren't really objective, and building or heating a narrative based on fear, in this case of infectious disease. Of course, this is a kind of a portable strategy that can be used for a lot of things involving fear. And the training of the population in a kind of a Pavlovian way, if you think about the Pavlovian studies involving dogs and food and bells, so that the bell that is being rung, that is being used to train all of us through these various methods, including neurolinguistic programming, is a bell having to do with a fear object in the case of COVID, or in the case of bird flu. This is about our fourth or fifth round of bird flu scare. And one of the things that's emphasized in this spycraft narrative is that as you know, what one does as you reach and achieve the objective, maybe the objective is profit for pharma, or the objective is upward transfer of wealth, or compliance with some new control mechanism like vaccine passports and personal and digital IDs, or central bank digital currency, or we can go on with these various initiatives that are very much based on kind of the China model of more centralized control mechanisms. Then once you've achieved whatever your objective is, which can be also financial disruption of another nation's state if you're a hostile intelligence community implementing this, then typically you'll resolve it with some kind of God out of the machine, Deus ex machina thing that magically will solve the problem. But it's important, it's emphasized in this strategy, to keep the topic alive at a lower level, this kind of lower level fear of influenza or bird flu or whatever the thing is, because it's very useful. You've now trained the population to respond to that bell, that specific bell. And so you want to keep that bell around, and you want to keep that training active, because you may want to ring that bell at some point in the future, as is being done with bird flu right now.
With the grant funding that exists, I mean, I always warn, Eisenhower actually warned the American populace in his farewell address, not just about the military-industrial complex, but about research institutions relying on government grants, because then they become beholden and push the government's bidding. You talk in psychological bioterrorism and PsyWar, but you also talk about techno-totalitarianism. You talk about surveillance capitalism. Can you explain this to the audience?
Surveillance capitalism is a super important topic, and it's well understood. I was just talking to somebody whose son is one of the elite in Silicon Valley of bazillionaires, and a good friend of Elon Musk's. And I asked him about what he knew about surveillance capitalism. He kind of got a twinkle in his eye, and he turned it back. Well, what do you know about surveillance capitalism? So in large part, surveillance capitalism is the business model that made Silicon Valley profitable. Particularly the social media-based companies made them profitable. And you may not be familiar with the word, which I didn't invent, but it's an important concept that most people are aware of at the periphery of their sensitivity to what's going on in the world. Many have had this odd experience where you're talking to a significant other or some other person in your life about some object. Boy, I sure like Porsche cars. And suddenly you log on and Google is pushing media towards you about, that you could buy. Or you're talking about the need for a hairspray or some ornament or something, and you log on to Amazon, and not your problem. And suddenly Amazon is pushing these things at you that relate to what you were just talking about. Well, it turns out that Google has a switch that is in the settings. Of course, you got to scroll way down to the bottom of the settings in Google to find it. It's a little obscure, but it's got a switch that if you don't turn it off, you're authorizing it to listen in on any audio activity around your open laptop. And that's a little spooky when you think about it. Don't put your laptop in your bedroom. I'll leave it at that. But especially in light of the recent revelations concerning the NSA. For those who aren't following the story, over 100 NSA officers just got their pink slips consequent to using your tax dollars to engage in sex chats. So you catch my point. Unless you are sophisticated in your use of various tools, you will be surveilled. If you're using Alexa or whatever, you're just, opening the door for this. And so what's done in surveillance capitalism, in short, is to gather as much data about you and your behaviors and your desires and your practices and your buying habits and everything else about you, your financial status, your indebtedness, all characteristics, and to integrate that or engage in a data fusion exercise, as the intelligence community calls it, to create a comprehensive profile of you. And then that, of course, this involves a lot of artificial intelligence, and we all know the problems with AI. It's particularly the current iterations are machine learning based. And so they're kind of stupid. They're just kind of a fancy way to analyze and aggregate data involving training algorithms. And it's a case, as I learned when I was a young coder in my youth in the early 80s, garbage in, garbage out. So that's the problem with AI in general. But all of this gets processed through AI to create a profile of who you are and everything about you. And then that gets aggregated and parsed in various ways and then sold as behavioral futures. This is the important concept. And behavioral futures are akin to stock futures. They're predictions of what will happen in the future, what your buying habits will be, what your political interests will be, and every other aspect of your life. And this is all marketable information. And so I argue that functionally what they're doing is they are stealing, because they're not asking you for permission to do this. They're defaulting to, we do have permission to do this by way of your using our application or getting into your GM truck, by the way. That's OnStar, as Ken Paxton is busy suing GM for that. But, you don't know that your car is constantly spying on you. If you have one of these empowered refrigerators with a chip, your fridge is spying on you. Your thermostat in your house is spying on you, all for the best, of course. And all of this data gets aggregated into a model of who you are. And then it gets sold. Because you're not being asked for this, I argue that it's being stolen from you. And that logic is based on the anarcho-capitalist logic of Murray Rothbard, that there's only two ways to accumulate wealth. One is through your own labors and interacting with the environment and resources to build value, true value. And the other is theft. And this is theft. What's happening is theft. They don't like it to be said that way, but that's what they're doing. They're stealing this information from you in a variety of surreptitious ways, and then they're aggregating it, reformulating it, and selling it to whoever wants to buy it. You don't know who wants to buy it. This is an adjacent...
And the government just takes that information.
Well, so the government no longer has to worry in many ways about wiretapping or getting authorization from the specialty court that they've set up that is very lenient. They could just buy it from Google or Amazon or whomever. And then it's all, the hands are all washed clean. And Zuckerberg gets his nickel or Bezos gets his nickel, and it's all on the square in terms of the Constitution. So where this goes as an adjacency is the next step in this is building avatars. And most of us have seen the movie Avatar. You have an idea of what the word means, a surrogate of you that is not you. And in this case, the vision is that as we progress to a world dominated increasingly by general autonomous artificial intelligence, that's what potentially will come out of the Stargate initiative. And I think that's the true purpose of the Stargate initiative that President Trump was talking about on his second day after his inauguration. So the idea is that you're an avatar of you that will reflect everything you've ever said, written, done, etc., can be uploaded at some point onto, just a minute, I have to tell this person to go away, potential spam. So your surrogate can be uploaded in one version of this, the transhumanist version. It will allow you or a virtual you to become immortal. And that, of course, is the gateway to exploring the stars, because you don't have to have all of the environmental and support services necessary to maintain human life in an interstellar environment. It can just be digital. And it relates to this ancient, incessant effort on the part of some segments of humanity to achieve immortality. It relates to Yuval Harari's statements along the lines of, we no longer need God, we are God, or we are gods in this new future. The logic of transhumanism that, of course, we'll have Neuralink in the interim, so we can directly interface with the supermind of the general autonomous artificial intelligence that will have an IQ of a bazillion or whatever it is, and far exceeding years of mind, or aggregate years of mind put together. If you don't buy into this, then you will basically become akin to your pet dog. And to the extent that you're allowed to live, this feeds into the useless eaters logic. To the extent that you're allowed to live, you will be kind of a pet, maintained as almost a zoo animal by the new overlords that will be this machine-human fusion, transhuman reality. That's kind of where this is going. And in the interim, in the avatars, you'll be able to purchase, of course, or rent, better yet, Professor Nick Giordano avatar, who you can consult and get advice from and guidance whenever you feel so inclined. That's entirely based on the aggregate information that's been gleaned from your personal interactions in the world that have all been captured and digitized and sorted, parsed. So that's surveillance capitalism in a nutshell. It's got all kinds of kind of adjacencies that lead off into these various visions. And I like to point out that a large fraction of the folks that are busy advocating for transhumanism and this truly brave new world that they're talking about tend to be aging tech bros, approaching the end of their lives, or to get even a little stronger in my wording, aging godless tech bros that are facing their own mortality and are seeking some exit, which I find remarkably similar to you. Nick, I don't know if I'm that much older than you or not, because I'm not seeing the gray hair. You seem to be younger than I. So you may not remember that Walt Disney had his head frozen, because that was back in the day that a lot of the wealthy elites thought that was the way that they could be immortal, is they could cryogenically preserve their brain. And then at some future time, through some miracle of technology, their brain could be reawoken and attached to, I don't know, a robot or a dead person or a monkey or I don't know what, Frankenstein.
Yeah, the future they have for us is certainly terrifying, especially it's about predictive modeling, a lot of it, to predict our behaviors. And this is the bureaucratic mindset within government, not just under the Biden administration. This is the bureaucracy that has been at play. You pointed to John F. Kennedy, and starting then, some could argue FDR. We go all the way back, and that's the threat. What are your thoughts on the new administration, and what are you hoping to see out of this new administration when it comes to things like this and the bureaucracy and the power of the bureaucracy?
So thanks for asking that. I just published a Substack on, I think the title was MAHA, so the Make America Healthy Again acronym, Populism to Policy. And so we have these two kind of populist threads that have come fused, partially due to the serendipity of the forces at play during the last election that brought a 60s New Deal pre-Carter, pre-Reagan Democrat, Bobby, who was in favor of Kennedy Democrats. That turned out to be an indefensible political strategy to run for president, in part. It's still not really been tested whether there are Kennedy Democrats or old school Democrats still surviving, because the Democrat Party just was so aggressive in keeping him out that we never got to learn whether or not the D side of the electorate was willing to endorse what Bobby Kennedy was trying to sell him.
Yes, the people that said threats to democracy were the ones who decided.
So then, through a cascade of events, he kind of he elected. I'd advised on the sidelines through some channels that I still have open that Bobby should stay in the race as an independent and then he would lose, and he would ascend to being a senior spokesperson for this medical freedom movement, for children's health, and for the kind of policies that were surrounding that we now call MAHA, which Bobby didn't create MAHA. Bobby kind of assimilated MAHA. So that was my thesis for Bobby's trajectory, because he didn't want to run for president again. He's been there, done that. He's too old. He knows it. He elected his own choice after much consternation and meditation to join forces with Donald Trump, largely because the alternative that he might throw the election to Harris at Walz was worse than joining forces with Donald Trump. And there was this moment in time where Bobby expressed empathy for Mr. Trump after the first assassination attempt, and that seemed to open up a friendship. So I think there's some genuine bonding that occurred there. But in any case, he joined forces with Donald Trump, and we ended up with this MAGA, which, does Trump truly reflect MAGA, or is Trump a vehicle for MAGA? That's an open question. Is he really committed to a more sovereignist, libertarian, small government thesis that is kind of a derivative of the Tea Party movement? Or is he somewhat opportunistic and espouses many things that MAGA also believes in, like a muscular foreign policy and secure borders, but in other aspects, not so much. And so you ended up with this MAGA-MAHA fusion, where Make America Healthy Again is something that crosses, who doesn't want to be healthy again? And clearly chronic disease is a problem. And I can tell you, I don't think there's a single European that flies into American airports that doesn't say something along the lines of, my God, they're all fat. So, we do have problems. And so MAHA absolutely is something that cuts across traditional party lines. But MAGA, and if you say Doge is like the current ultimate expression of MAGA, and MAHA have fault lines between them. MAGA is a deregulatory movement. It's a small government movement. MAHA, in its core, they say it comes from the left, and it will have a tendency towards nanny state regulation. It will have a bias, because this bias is built into public health and the way we think about public health. Public health is intrinsically, I argue, socialist. It is based on utilitarianism. It is based on big data also, by the way, and on selective analysis of big data around a specific topic area, a disease, or whatever the thing is. And it has a tendency to be really myopic, short-sighted about the other things, the what you might call blowback if you're in the intelligence community, the peripheral damage that might be associated with the focus on that one thing. So in COVID, we got to see that in spades with this obsessive focus on the vaccines and disregarding of their harms, or the obsessive focusing on lockdowns and masking, disregarding notoriously in children the effects of these policies on education, learning, language, psychological development, etc. So that's classic public health. Public health seeks to optimize the greatest good for the greatest number, and to achieve a optimized, harmonized baseline public health status, so that we are all equally healthy, because we all have to comply with these protocols, etc., that are coming from the top down, through the government, through our insurance agencies, through hospitals, all of this kind of big top down, saying this is the way you must behave, and these are the things you must eat, and these are the vaccines you must accept, and these are the drugs that you must be treated with, and this is the way you have to be treated. Remember, back in the good old days, healthcare was a personal decision, and it was kind of a consultation between a healthcare provider, we could call them physicians for sake of argument, but there's many others, and a patient. It was kind of a transactional relationship. You come, you might say, I hate doctors. I'm not going to go to the doctor, and I'm just going to make my own decisions about how I manage my care. And if I break my arm, I'm going to go to some local healer that's going to splint it or whatever. Or you might be somebody who goes to the doctor and says, doctor, give me the news. Just tell me what I need to do. That's, one way as a physician that I can tell you that patients approach things. And some patients actually want to have a dialogue and make a decision with you. It's a range. But the idea that you have to do this and doctors have to do this, they have to behave this way that is consistent with algorithms that we have that are, by the way, totally compatible with some future of you walk up at CVS and you interact with a keyboard and it goes to some AI and it comes back and it says, here's your differential diagnosis. And you have X, and then you have some expat physician living in Bangalore or Bangladesh that gets online and says, this is the prescription thou shalt take, and CVS dispenses it, and you go pay at the cash register. That's kind of where this is all going. And that's the current public health dominant metaphor. And the risk is that MAHA kind of feeds into that. And I talk in the essay that, like a lot of things, like nudge technology, what I talk about in the book, which is often used to support public health and various social causes, particularly in the UK, it's a slippery slope. We all agree at this point, there's national consensus that seatbelts are good and that all the car manufacturers need to be mandated to provide seatbelts. I don't think there's a big anti-seatbelt lobby right now. But we kind of crossed that Rubicon. And there is mostly a consensus that it's okay to have laws that say if you don't wear seatbelts, then you get ticketed and fined. And if you unpack that, a lot of that was justified on the thesis that if you are irresponsible and you don't use a seatbelt and you get in a crash, you incur excess expenses to the overall system through your insurance, hospitals, through subsidized care, Medicare, Medicaid, whatever, that you become a financial burden on all of us. And so we collectively have the right to take away that freedom, because that's what it is, to drive your car without wearing a seatbelt. And we've kind of collectively said, yeah. Then the next one adjacent to that was motorcycle helmets. And of course, cigarettes. As you continue to apply that logic, we could say that if you choose to eat a certain number of calories in excess of the requirements or too much protein, then you're costing all of us, and this is where it gets really insidious when you talk about climate change and the CO2 agenda. You're costing all of us, in the case of the CO2 narrative and anthropomorphic climate change, you're creating an existential crisis. We might all die because you are eating too much cow. So therefore, the public has the right to say that you must eat crickets and caterpillars and not beef. You follow, I'm taking that as an extreme example. So a more near-term, proximal example that I like to use because it most audiences can figure out what I'm talking about. I don't even have to say it. If someone chooses to eat McDonald's hamburgers and drink sugary Coca-Cola, they ought to have the right to do that, even though it's probably going to adversely impact on their health at some point in time. Even if that somebody happens to be someone that we're all paying a goodly salary to lead us. You get the point. So MAHA could easily go down that road of becoming an overbearing bridesmaid to the nanny state. Yet another one, which we don't really need. What I'm hoping is that let me take a step back. The history of American populism, and really populism all over the world, is not very pretty when you look at it. You have these bottom-up, autonomous upswelling of issues because things have gotten so bad. If you want to think about fourth turning or, there's a lot of different ways to think about this, getting some point in history where things have gotten so bad that all of the little people like you and I gets mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore, quoting the famous movie Network. And so we're going to do something. The Tea Party is a great example. We're going to do something. We're going to change Washington. We're going to march on Washington and we're going to beat the drum and wear our three-cornered hats. And a couple of years later, what changed? Okay, that's the history of populism. And the challenge is, how do you convert populism to sustainable policy? And executive orders are great. Amen. Fantastic what Trump's doing and what Bobby is working with and what MAHA is being facilitated with.
The next president could just as easily do them.
And so how do we make it sustainable? And furthermore, how do we set up the boundaries? Because as you appropriately pointed out, the history of bureaucracies is that they tend to have their own inertia, and they tend to want to get bigger and bigger and more overbearing. And so I argue that one of the things that it's great that we're doing all these short-term action-oriented items, that Bobby has this mandate from the president to show measurable, demonstrable improvements in citizens' health in the United States within 12 to 18 months. God bless him. But I argue that in parallel, we ought to be taking a little bit of time and thinking hard about this interface, this challenging, difficult interface of defining the boundaries between the rights of the collective and the rights of the individual as it relates specifically to health. There's almost no literature on that because this is all new. Now, that's an opportunity for the likes of you and I, or for the Mises Institute or anyone else to kind of step in the think tank world, to step in and say, hey, let's look at this. Let's have some conferences. Let's talk about it. Let's see if we can figure out some guidelines so that as hopefully MAHA and MAGA move towards a broader new consensus within the U.S. electorate and eventually get reduced into legislation because there'll be support from the public for those changes, that we have some guidelines about where we ought to draw the boundaries. So that's my thoughts on this movement right now.
And I think that's critically important. I mean, liberty and the idea of limited government are essential. Our founders knew that from the beginning, and it's always been a struggle, that balance between liberty and order within society. It's very, very difficult to walk that fine line, and we see it every day. I mean, even in this administration, you just pointed out great conflicts that do exist. Dr. Malone, always a pleasure. Everyone needs to check out PsyWar, Enforcing the New World Order. I know I kept you on longer than anticipated, but it's a great conversation, and we'll have links up at the PAS Report website, PASreport.com, to the Substack so people can read the articles for themselves. Dr. Malone, always a pleasure to discuss the issues with you.
Thanks for having me on, Nick, and keep thinking.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.